So what I'm going to do today is give just a couple minutes on my own background, and I'm going to save time at the end for questions and comments, so you can be thinking about that as we go along. I'm going to give you something of a history about the European Union, the EU privacy law, and there's very strict limits in Europe where the data can't leave Europe if it is going to a place that isn't safe. It has to have adequate protection when it goes there. And the highest court in the European Union, the Court of Justice, in 2020, came out with a big opinion that if you read it, looks like it prohibits, that it bars many or most flows of personal data from Europe to the United States. Illegal to send data back to the United States from Europe. And that's sort of disturbing for the economists in the world because the annual economic connection between Europe and the United States is estimated at over $7 trillion, so you don't really wipe that out. And the seriousness of the threats exemplified by Facebook telling its shareholders a few months ago, we now have a material risk that we will be kicked out of Europe and not able to do business in Europe anymore. So you as shareholders have to know this is a real thing that might happen. And so when big companies start saying that to their shareholders, it's a sign that this is real. In October, President Biden issued an executive order that puts some new privacy protections in place for Europeans, and we'll talk about that. And we're also going to talk about how that fits together with serious proposals to have a U.S. national privacy law. The U.S. is unusual among countries in the world right now for not having a general privacy law when you go online, and it might really pass soon. So we'll see how that fits in with the European Union. So that's an overview. From my own background, I went to school for a long time, but I wanted to point out the one in the middle where I had a one-year fellowship after college to go to Brussels, Belgium, and study in the Institute of European Studies there. I thought this was a goof. I was there for a year. Belgium was great. It's a country the size of Maryland. There were 300 kinds of beer in Belgium when I was there, and I was only there for 200 days. So, I had challenges being there. I didn't think I was studying real stuff. And instead, it turned out I was studying European Union law, and a lot of my career since then has turned out to be this accidental stuff that I did in the year I thought I wasn't taking seriously. So you never know how you might learn from different experiences along the way. As Professor Truex mentioned, I was a professor, including at The Ohio State University. I taught there back in the years with Ohio State always beat Michigan. That's no longer apparently the case, but that was a very important thing when I was there. And I taught a lot of different courses in law school, including privacy law beginning in 1997. And I was, I think, the first law professor to teach a semester course on the law of cybersecurity a few years after that. As mentioned, I've been in government 3 times in 3 White House appointments. The chief counselor for privacy under President Clinton. I was during the housing crisis in the Office of Economic Policy with Larry Summers. And after Snowden happened, President Obama created something called the Review Group on NSA. What should we do about the NSA? And I'll say a little bit more about that. I've also done work over time with other federal agencies, including the National Academies of Science. So one of the things I did get out of my time doing the NSA Review Group is this photo. So you probably recognize the gentleman on the right. 2 seats on the left, the one who looks like he's asleep, that's me, right? And we were talking about what should be done about the NSA, which in some ways protects America really, really well, and in other ways could threaten our privacy. And so that was what our report was about, and a lot of the recommendations actually happened. So in recent years, I've been at Georgia Tech. We now have a school of cybersecurity and privacy there, and I'm also in the business school. But I'm in a strange world where I was trained as a law professor and a lawyer, but my university doesn't have a law school. So where disciplines end and where you have to learn new things has been something. And since I was in the government on that review group, we've been working on topics about cross-border data requests. And I now lead a think tank also called the Cross-Border Data Forum. Let's talk a little bit about European privacy law, about why it's legitimate and why it makes sense. But there was already a court decision back in 2015 named after Max Schrems. Max Schrems is a sort of civil liberties lawyer in Europe and back in 2015 in the first case, the court struck down something called the safe harbor that US had with Europe. And it was found out that there was too much US national security surveillance. 2015 is 2 years after Snowden in 2013. And the court there was worried now that US surveillance apparatus was threatening European privacy. The US and Europe signed a new deal called Privacy Shield shortly after that. And then there was the GDPR, the European Privacy Law. How many of you had heard of GDPR, the European Privacy Law, before this? About a third, half the room. It is the most copied and most rigorous privacy law in most respects in the world. European Union has something like 600 or 700 million people in it. It's a great big economy. And if you're gonna do business in Europe, you have to match it. And other countries, including Japan and South Korea and a lot of others, have basically adopted laws similar to it. So then in 2020, the case I started with, the second Schrems case, they said the New Deal, the Privacy Shield, wasn't good enough. And now Europe is really cracking down on US-based companies that transfer data out of Europe. And now, to address that, President Biden and the European Union announced a data privacy framework in October. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about one piece of that, which are called the redress provisions, which is part that I've worked on. And just yesterday, the European regulators, the European Data Protection Board, issued their opinion on this framework with Europe and the United States. And on the redress part, which people had thought was the hardest part, they basically said it's now good enough. So getting the strict European regulators to say it's good enough, that was a sigh of relief and a little bit of a surprise, but that's what we have. I've been working on privacy in Europe since 1998 when this book came out called None of Your Business, World Data Flows, Electronic Commerce, and the European Privacy Directive. And I've also worked on national security law, so privacy and national security are part of the background. And so I've been working on this as a major part of my work stuff ever since. So where does Europe come off saying you can't transfer data to the United States? And here's the slide that tries to tell you some of that. So the European Union and its 27 or whatever it is member states, they have jurisdiction over economic activity in Europe. If they want to pass a minimum wage law, they can do that. If they want to pass an environmental rule, they can do that. If they want to pass a rule about privacy, data privacy and protecting it, they can do that. And that's data privacy law about personal data collected in Europe, right? People doing stuff on their computers in Europe in the course of their normal daily life. So Europe has a perfectly good basis for worrying about European people's privacy. And the next thing is, if you're going to have these privacy laws, they ought to be enforceable. That makes sense. And so Europe has said it's only going to be lawful to transfer personal data, to have it leave that European protection, if it's still going to be adequately protected when it leaves Europe. And otherwise, they could have strict laws in Europe, and then they could ship it to the United States, and everybody could just put it up on the internet, and there'd be no protections. And that would be a pretty frustrating privacy regime, strict in Europe, but then it just gets shipped outside and doesn't get protected anymore. So when they passed their first directive in 1998 and now GDPR, they have rules that say you can't ship it out of Europe unless it's protected. They have what are called standard contractual clauses to ship data under a contract from one company to another. They've had these deals with the US called Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield. And the idea is we're going to protect data if it's transferred. And if it's not protected, then it's not supposed to leave Europe. So that's where they come off having this legal approach. And this might be too detailed here. So the Safe Harbor applied to commercial data. That was in 2000. I was the White House privacy guy when we negotiated that. And the main point under Safe Harbor is if the US company treats data as if it's still in Europe, then it's okay to ship it. So data's in Europe, it gets shipped to the United States, but we treat it like it's still European data. And these contract clauses, same thing. They're created so you make a deal, you ship it from Europe to some other country, and that's good enough. But in these Schrems cases, the problem wasn't that the companies violated privacy. In the Schrems cases, to everyone's surprise, the problem was they say the companies do it perfectly. That's okay. We're not complaining about that. It's that the government, once the data gets to the US government can look at that data. And it's the US government surveillance and intrusions that make it unsafe to send stuff to the United States. That's what the Court of Justice, their court, has said. And the pro for that, the logic of that, is that it's going to be required to protect data privacy rights, and we don't want the governments to take away the protections that are supposed to happen when it goes, let's say, to the United States or to China or to anywhere else. On the other hand, this is the European Union and their judges judging the quality of how US does national security, or China, or India, or whoever else it is. And that's like Europe being a little presumptuous, maybe, telling the US how to run its own country. And also, there's huge potential disruptions, because we thought we had a global internet, but now Europe's going to say, your government's good enough, your government's not good enough, your government's good enough. There's nothing companies can do about that. They just operate where the government is. And now there's uncertainty globally about the data that's leaving Europe. It's a potentially big disruption in the name of protecting privacy and protecting rights, but it's a big potential disruption. So I think I've said a lot of this, but now I'm going to talk a little bit more about redress and how that works. So the rules, the previous rounds weren't good enough, the court said. And here's the European fundamental right. Here's the way to think about it. Fundamental right is, let's say you all live in Europe, and you are worried that the NSA, the National Security Agency, is looking at your data too much. The US is doing unlawful surveillance of you. What Europe law says is, you have a right to check to make sure the NSA is following the law. So the data starts with you in France or whatever, and the data then gets transferred under these contracts to the United States. But if the NSA is looking at it, then the right of the individual is to make sure the government's not going too far. And they have rights to do that, at least in theory, for French law. France has an agency to do that. Now, you might think it's pretty weird that just some random person in France could make the NSA see if the NSA was doing too much surveillance. And I'll agree, for national security folks, that is very strange and weird. It doesn't matter. Right now, if we don't get a deal with Europe on this, if we don't have a way for that French person to get redress, then the court's going to say it's not okay. And it's so not okay that transfers from Facebook and everybody else are now illegal. So how do we fix this? And so this was one of the two main issues. The other issue is what's called disproportionate surveillance. One of the two main issues that their Supreme Court went after. And with the Cross-Border Data Forum, we started trying to work on an answer because it's complicated. So the decision from the court came out in the summer of 2020. And with a co-author, I made an initial proposal for how to fix redress. And that turned out not to work. And that December, I testified in front of the US Senate on another way you could do it, how you could do it either by statute or not by statute. And then there was a bunch of feedback on that, and that didn't work. So that was 2020. 2021, with the team, we were trying to come up with every possible way you could try to build this thing. And eventually, last January and February, we came up with two articles. Here's an article why it's okay for Europe if we don't have a statute from Congress. And here's a reason, under US law, with all the US weird constitutional stuff, how you could create an independent authority that could give redress to those French people when they're checking on the NSA. So that was the proposal. And then when the executive order came out, it pretty much tracked our January and February articles, more than 90%. And then we wrote afterwards explaining why this is okay, and that's what yesterday the European regulators said was okay, so we got a redress proposal. And the simplified version of what we did is the French person makes a complaint, the US government receives the complaint, the US government does an independent investigation, hey, Jean-Claude, you know, has your stuff been looked at? An independent adjudication by new judges, and that way the judges answer back, it's okay or it's not okay. If it's not okay, they fix it. So President Biden has said, if it's not okay, all the agencies have to follow the decision of the court. We have a whole new structure in place. There's still secrecy. The US government doesn't tell people how the surveillance is happening. And it's part of a broader set of safeguards against NSA snooping. And if there's any unlawful surveillance, the data gets deleted or it gets fixed. So this will be in place for Europeans, interestingly enough, not for US people. This will be in place for Europeans when the whole thing goes into effect. So in conclusion on the EU and the trade war possibility, the $7 trillion of mess, we're a long way towards having an agreement, but Mr. Schrems has said he's going to sue again. Like, he's won twice in their Supreme Court, why not do it again? And some aspects of the deal, the non-redress stuff, some aspects of the deal, let me just say, are more subject to criticism. Like, I can see how the courts might not like it. So we're going to have continuing problems. But there's one big thing that would help Europe feel better about the United States. The thing that would help Europe feel better about the United States is if the US put a general privacy law in place, then they would think maybe the US is okay. Maybe we dare to ship data there. So now I'm going to show you two maps. See if you can tell the difference. These are the countries that had privacy laws as of 1998, and red is the full-scale privacy law. Greenland is part of Denmark, and it's not that big a population, but basically a few countries in 1998. Okay, you got this one visually. The US has some pieces of privacy law in gray. So that's 1998. Any different by 2021? Yeah. The red are the countries that have passed comprehensive privacy laws. China since then has put its into place. India is under constitutional requirements to pass its, which would leave the United States as the major exception to the global regime of having privacy laws. Maybe then you see why some people in Europe think, why would we ship data to the US when the US is the privacy we don't care country? The privacy we don't regulate country. Okay, so let's think about that. How does that map look to Europe? On the one hand, the court's decision in Schrems is not about the commercial transfers. Companies can promise to be good with data. It's about government surveillance. And so passing a general commercial privacy law doesn't actually address the court's decision. It doesn't fix the problem. On the other hand, how would the US look if the US got colored in red, right? If the US got colored in red here, now the US looks like the rest of the world. We look like we treat this stuff seriously instead of looking like the one country that doesn't care about this. And so that might help Europeans think that sending data, and by the way, do the Europeans use any US-based tech companies? Yeah, Google has 90% of search in some of the countries in Europe, and Meta and Amazon and Apple and all the rest. So they're thinking right now, stuff goes from Europe to the US, and US is the uniquely place where there's not a set of general privacy protections in place, even if the companies say they're going to be good with the data. So can a US privacy law go through Congress? Here's the advantage of doing your slides the day you present. This morning, when I was doing my morning email reading, here's a quote from one of the trade press things. The House Energy and Commerce leaders, the House of Representative leaders in a major committee, have emphasized bipartisanship. That is a word that's still allowed to be used in Washington. It's just not done very often. Emphasized bipartisanship and meticulously building consensus around the elements of a federal data privacy measure as the panel looks to capitalize on last year's success and actually get it signed into law. So that's a news story from this morning. Is President Biden on board? Well, his State of the Union said we should pass a bipartisan legislation to impose stricter limits on personal data that companies collect. If you've got the Congress on board and you got the president on board and you're talking bipartisan, this could actually happen. It's not crazy to think we'll have a US federal privacy law passed. Now, why hasn't, am I doing that right? Yeah. Why hasn't it passed up until now? Well, one reason is it's really hard to pass a big, complicated bill that's hundreds of pages of long through Congress. It has to go to different committees in the House. It has to go to different committees in the Senate. It's a big political mess, and I've worked in Washington, and it's hard to do that. When we left, when the Clinton administration finished in 2000, beginning of 2001, it seemed like America was heading towards privacy law. HIPAA happened for medical care, banking privacy had passed, telecom privacy had passed. It looked like the US was getting ready to pass something for online. But 9/11 happened in 2001. And when 9/11 happened, it was like, get the data, stop the terrorists. It wasn't pass a big privacy law. So all the momentum for legislation sort of disappeared for years. Also, how does industry feel about having burdensome regulations, right? If you were going to the American corporation and say, would you like to have burdensome regulations? Are they going to raise their hand? Not usually, right? And also, different companies want this and different companies want that, and different sectors can live with this, but they can't live with that. And so there's opposition from a lot of the interest groups. Plus, you know, don't want to be too pessimistic, but these days it's hard to pass anything in Congress. They can't pick a Speaker of the House. They can't do a lot of stuff. So it's a mess. Like, why would we think US privacy law might pass? That's a sort of puzzle. So are we just delusional in thinking it might pass? But there's some things that are different now when it comes to privacy legislation. The one that fits this talk is it would help a lot with the European Union. There are companies, US companies, the ones I named operating abroad, they're already complying with GDPR, the European rules. If you've already got the compliance system in place and you just apply it to the US people, it's not that hard. You've got your systems already up and running. And those companies really would like, Facebook would like an agreement with Europe, because Facebook might get shut out of Europe in the next few months otherwise. Okay, that helps. And the companies that do business in Europe, the ones I've named, those are important companies. If you have them on your side, you might get legislation passed. Another thing is California went and passed a big consumer privacy bill a few years ago. How many people had heard about the California privacy law that had passed? If you lived in California, you would have heard about it because you get notices all the time. California as an economy, if it was its own country, would be the 5th biggest gross domestic product of any country in the world. It's a big economy in California. So companies that do business there have had to do, let's call it a third or a half of GDPR already. They're already having to build it in for California. And then businesses saying, wait a second, it's not just California. Colorado went and passed a law. Connecticut did. Utah, Virginia. And a bunch of other states are considering passing laws. So now imagine you're a company operating in the United States and your privacy data system has to be different for 50 different states. Like, that's a nightmare operationally to build. Huh, okay. So we've got all these state laws that have changed things. Industry's getting stuck with state laws. And what do you know? Industry has now come out in favor of a uniform national privacy law. The US Chamber of Commerce supports it. The US Chamber of Commerce never wants burdensome government regulation of industry. The US Chamber of Commerce has switched here because they don't like California stuff. And they're saying, now we need a privacy law. Go privacy, we love privacy. And that, you just don't see that very often from the US Chamber of Commerce. They only want it if it preempts the state laws, if it stops California from passing 5 new laws after this. But if we had a uniform but strict privacy law, then maybe the privacy people are happy and maybe business can live with it. And just another thing is, polls show like 80% of Americans would prefer to have a privacy bill of rights, basically, when you go online, so you don't think these devices are snooping on you as much. And having 80% support would seem relevant in a democracy, right? If 80% of the people want it, we hope our democratic institutions would pass it. And I have a hypothesis, slightly tongue-in-cheek. My hypothesis is that senators and Congress people are people also. Like, they have families, they have their own lives. They are creeped out by the weird stuff that shows up in their advertisements. And so you have members and the public going with something that industry now goes with, that the rest of the world goes with, and can help us maybe make a deal with Europe. Oh my gosh. So this maybe, who knows, could actually happen. How's it doing in Congress? So the big bill that people are looking at, hundreds of pages of long, you're not in my privacy class, so you do not have to read it today. But it passed last summer in July from the House Energy and Commerce Committee. What was the vote? 53 in favor and 2 opposed. Like, okay, that's a big vote. There's a lot of people in that committee, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, all that kind of stuff. And they had leaders in the Senate favoring it also. So it's the first time we've had a bipartisan, bicameral, serious privacy bill. And it's stalled late in the year for reasons that don't apply this year anymore, but it's back this year, as we saw this morning. And how does the US government tend to pass big, complicated bills? Well, usually, because I've worked in Washington over the years, you spend a lot of time trying to pass the financial reform bill one year, it doesn't pass, but then the next year, maybe they're ready to pass it because they've worked out 90% of the tough issues the first year. They've gotten a lot of people on record supporting it. Now we come to this year, we've got 3 or 4 issues to try to fix, and maybe we can fix 3 or 4 issues and get it done. For instance, if the US Congress wanted to show that it actually functions and does something this year or next year, instead of just being screaming at each other all the time, here's a bipartisan bill they could pass that everybody's already on record as favoring. So I've always been skeptical it's too hard to pass a privacy bill, but we now have a pretty good story for why you all might see a privacy bill. Well, would it protect us much? Here's what the law would do. It would broadly cover businesses that process personal information. Small businesses get somewhat of a break, but they have to do it. You'd have clear transparency and notice about how they handle your data. That often exists already. You'd have a bunch of consumer rights. You'd have a right to access your data. Do you know today, under the medical rules, you can get your medical records from the hospital and stuff? This would be a general right. If you wanted Amazon to give you all the stuff you've done with Amazon, they'd have to give you access to it. If there's mistakes in there, they correct it. If you say, I don't want Amazon anymore to have it, they have to delete it. They would have portability. If you feel stuck in one social network and you want to move your stuff to another social network, you could do that. The bill would have a mechanism to opt out of targeted marketing. If you're creeped out by having those ads follow you and you don't want your friends to see it when they see your computer, you'd be able to say, I don't want targeted marketing. And in a sort of interesting new thing, there'd be something they call the duty of loyalty, which says the companies are there to act loyally on your behalf as their customer. The way that, you know, a guardian is supposed to act on behalf of the kid, or a lawyer is supposed to act on behalf of their client, is saying to the big data companies, you're supposed to act in ways that help the consumers. Now, exactly how to define that, they're fighting over it still, but we'll see. And one of the things that motivates this is parents don't like their kids being tracked unless they're doing it, right? They know where your iPhone is, but you know, a lot of parents get freaked out about their 12-year-old or their 14-year-old, and so there's a bunch of rules protecting kids' privacy. There's new limits on the companies that sell databases about your personal information. And in an area that's very relevant to the computer scientists here and also to people who are concerned about civil rights, there's a new series of protections and examinations about when you do new algorithms, like for machine learning and AI, would there be civil rights effects? Would it discriminate against various groups? And there's supposed to be new safeguards about that. So this is a civil rights bill. The last thing I'll mention on this is there's two other parts that people really love to get angry about. So private right of action means you can sue. The bill would have a private right of action. You'd have to wait a couple of years till it goes into effect. But if the company violates the laws, you would get to sue the companies. Usually, Republicans and business people hate that so much it can't get through Congress. But there's another thing, there's preemption. Preemption says the federal law is going to apply even though California passed stricter laws. And usually the Democrats and the liberals don't want that. They want California to be able to go protect people's rights more. So basically speaking, the Republicans gave up on suing people and the Democrats gave up on preemption, more or less. So both sides have given ground on stuff they never compromise on, and they got a 53-2 vote on it. And that's a building place to maybe come to a full agreement this year. Anyway, if all that happened, would that seem like a significant change to like how stuff works? I mean, I think it would. Companies, you know, companies that haven't already built compliance programs would have to comply with that. But if you do GDPR, if you do California, you're already doing 80 or 90% of this. So for a lot of the major companies, they've got the systems built. They can live with this. With some stuff they'd have to do new, but a lot of it's built already. So my last slide, and then I'm really open for questions and comments from everybody. Data privacy is a fundamental right in EU law. It's in their equivalent of their constitution, their Charter of Fundamental Freedoms. And under the EU law, you can't transfer data unless there's adequate protection. And their Court of Justice, the Court of Justice of the European, has clearly stated that redress and these other protections have to be there. It's not going to compromise. You can't do a compromise with the Supreme Court. You're stuck with what they say about the law. And in Europe, they don't even have an amendment process. So you're really stuck with the law. If the court doesn't go along with it, this isn't going to work. On the redress, the part that my colleagues and I worked on, I said it's not a compromise, it's a Rubik's Cube. You can read these articles if you really want to. And there was like all these different constraints we had to build towards. But now, after all this work, we, I think, can create a lasting agreement on that complies with all the requirements of EU law and US law. And then how do we help get the judges over the hump on the European side when they're skeptical about these US-based companies doing terrible things to Europeans? Well, a new US privacy law with real protections for individuals would make them think they're sending data from Europe where the privacy is under the rule of law to the United States where they think then it would be under the rule of law. That would be good policy. I support the privacy bill. It would be good politics. Congress can go with it and Europe can live with it. And it would really help us avoid the trade war. And then instead of having a big fight on this, it makes it easier for the European Union and the US to act like allies again. And I think that would be a good thing too. So thanks for your attention. Okay, sir, go ahead.
I certainly understand the data privacy with companies.
Yes.
How does, I mean, we used to have use at 18 in this country.
Yeah, for US persons, right.
And I listened to a couple of these things. How does NSA surveillance factor in to corporate stuff?
Well, how does NSA surveillance figure into corporate stuff? There's something called FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. You know the acronym, a lot of people don't know the acronym. There's a program under that. One of the programs is called PRISM and one's called Upstream. And Snowden blew the whistle on what these things were. PRISM happens where the National Security Agency, under a set of rules, goes to Facebook and says, we're investigating Peter. Here's his email, here's his phone number, give us what you have on Peter. That's the PRISM program. There's another program where they connect to the internet backbone, this is Upstream, where they're surveilling Peter from my email, and all the traffic's coming through, and if it gets a hit for one of the emails they care about, in this case they've gotten approval to go after Peter, they then get the email that's going through the internet backbone. So both of those things were revealed by Snowden. Both of those are under the law and have a lot of oversight and rules on them. And both of them have made Europeans sort of frantic and mad and wondering what the NSA is doing. So after Snowden, after the NSA review group, after Congress passed a new law in 2015, there are clearer, and in my view, good safeguards around both PRISM and Upstream. You could believe it or not, and people wonder what happens behind the secret curtain. But the rule is now that there's protections in place with judicial supervision from real federal judges. So the answer to Europe is, you're worried about this, but it's under a legal regime that actually is pretty reasonable.
I also have a second question, which is, how would individuals be able to go after their own state government for violating data privacy, like in Georgia, where the entire election system was open to the net for almost a year?
Well, we're not going to solve the election system of Georgia today here. I have colleagues who spend their days and nights worrying about that. So one of the strange things about this redress proposal is Jean-Claude from France can make sure the NSA isn't doing too much surveillance. But you all, in the United States, we don't have a system for you to check the same way. That is bizarre. The only reason we're doing it is, if we don't do it, the European court will strike down everything again, and so US has made a deal on that. I'm inclined to go to other questions, but there are a few things. So what else? We got 1, 2, 3. Okay, go ahead. I'm 4. Yeah.
Stretching a bit, but can you interpret some of the cybercrime, ransomware attacks on data privacy? I mean,
Oh, sure.
your data, and then, like the map that you showed internationally showed supposedly a lot of these kinds of actions and things. I mean, is there some leverage internationally to get other countries to start crack down on some of this?
Okay, there's like 10 questions in that. I'm not quite sure. By the way, if we pass privacy laws, would there still be criminal attacks on data? Yes. Apparently some people have smoked marijuana even though it's against the law. Apparently some people have gone past the speeding limit. So passing a law doesn't automatically mean it's happening. But for the bigger companies where they have automated compliance systems in place, they'll look increasingly bad if they just ignore these rules. So I think it does change behavior. We just don't get it to 100%. I'm not sure I can answer all the other things you... Who did I say number 2? Number 2 and then 3 back there. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think one of the problems is that there's a huge amount of immense lobbying power, and so with that, it's sort of in their best interest to sort of collect all this data. Is that one reason why
Sure.
it's so long to
Well, yeah, I mean, so it's easier for Europe to regulate Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, because they're foreign countries. They're sort of like the US looking at TikTok, and you were in the earlier thing today when we talked about that. So they're looking at foreign companies, the American tech companies, and are willing to regulate it. And those companies in Washington have been very popular. You know, you create trillions of dollars of value, people like you sometimes, lots of jobs and stuff. What's changed is all of those companies operate in Europe. All of those companies operate in California. All of those companies are already now getting regulated up the wazoo from these other places. If the US passes a law, it doesn't change their life much, except it gives them closer to a global regime that they can comply to. So they've gone from being against it for years, or they wanted to tweak it so it helped Facebook or it helped Google, to now they're saying, we just got to get this thing passed. And so that's a very different moment from where they were earlier, is part of why the whole thing really might pass. In back, we had a woman. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, so the first time I was in government, I was the privacy guy. And there was an initiative to update wiretap laws from the telephone era to the wiretap age, to the internet age. And the FBI was going to be in the room, the CIA, the NSA, all the three-letter agencies were going to be in the room, and they were all going to be saying, we need these capabilities to protect America. And then I was like the one privacy guy. And so John Podesta, the chief of staff, said, Peter, you're going to chair the process because that's supposed to somehow create a counterbalance of all this. And we worked on it over a bunch of months and actually issued a consensus proposal that got introduced in Congress in 2000. And it was addressing a lot of the issues that needed to be addressed. It didn't pass. 2001 was the next year, and 9/11 happened. They basically took out the privacy protections and tripled the surveillance stuff, and that was the Patriot Act. So, but you asked about what was it like to work with these folks. The people who work in those agencies, in my experience, wake up every morning thinking they are here to protect America and do good things. They don't wake up every morning saying, I want to spy on my fellow citizens. That's not why they signed up for it. That's not where they get their jollies. It's not like fun to listen to phone calls. That's not why they're doing it. And when we were in the review group and we were at NSA and at the other agencies, one of my colleagues was a guy who had been a leader for the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. His name's Jeffrey Stone. He's an eminent law professor at Chicago. And he came out afterwards saying, I was so surprised, he said. I came in thinking that these spy agencies were out of control. And I came out having so much more respect for how they wake up every day trying to do what's right. And so that's an ACLU spokesperson who had a chance to go on the inside. And his view was much more positive when he got on the inside. And that's consistent with my own experience. But, you don't know what happens behind the curtain. And we always have to stay vigilant because bad things can happen and stuff can get out of control. And God knows there's things that get messed up behind the curtain. But in general, these people wake up in the morning trying to do things that are good for our country, for the country here, and for our allies, and not, and I think the view of the U.S. intelligence service in Europe has changed somewhat since the Russia attack a year ago. I don't know if you remember a year ago, before the attack happened, the president and the U.S. intelligence service saying, we anticipate an attack here. We need to be really, really prepared. We're not kidding. It's not just blowing smoke. This is real. And they worked with the Ukrainian government. They worked with the frontline states like Poland and the Baltic states. And U.S. intelligence was right, was out front, and that was crucial to mobilizing NATO to have a unified front afterwards. And so U.S. intelligence about Russia looks like it's been a super important component of having Russia not run over Ukraine and then threaten the rest of Eastern Europe. So that's a little bit different way to look at U.S. intelligence capabilities than just as threatening civil liberties. You were for? Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one is, so in case countries join or leave the EU, for example, we had Brexit.
Yeah.
Is there any change in policy as to how data is outflow and
Right.
storage of existing data from Britain?
Okay. That's number one. What's number two?
And the second one is that, for example, in the new bill, is there any penalties for companies knowing vulnerabilities in data systems
There is a data security provision which basically says companies have to use reasonable security measures, and it's not fleshed out in incredible detail.
But if there are vulnerabilities are known, can they be penalized or like sued for that?
So can you sue I'll do that first and then break. Can you sue companies who have known vulnerabilities? If you could go talk to any chief information security officer who tells you honestly what's going on, he or she will say, we have known weaknesses in our defenses because there's this many attacks and we have this much budget. And what we do is we prioritize the things we think are the biggest risks, but there's always stuff you never get around to it. Think about cleaning your house or your apartment, like really, really cleaning it. You might get the kitchen sink looking good. There's going to be back corners of the closet and stuff I predict will not be squeaky clean, right? You just don't get 100% coverage for stuff. And so saying there's some dirt in the apartment so you should get sued, or there's some vulnerability in your system so you should get sued, doesn't really tell you who should get sued because everybody could get sued if that's the standard. So it's not an easy thing to write the law about. What happened with Brexit and Europe? At the moment that the UK left the European Union, the moment of Brexit, it had GDPR as its law. So it had the same privacy law that Europe had, and then Europe had to decide if the UK was good enough. Because they can only ship data to England if there's adequate protections in England. And England said, yeah, duh, of course, we have the same law. And critics on the continent said, well, but the UK government has its intelligence services and their surveillance law is called the RIP Act, which you'd think would stand for rest in peace, like it's going to kill you. And it stands for something else, Regulation of Investigatory Powers. So at a level of propaganda, the RIP Act is deadly to civil liberties in the European Kingdom. So there was a big, long process, and the European Commission in the end said UK is good enough, under criticism from the privacy hawks who think it's not good enough. So right now it's okay to trade with the European Kingdom. You want to pick 2 or 3 more? That's 1. Any more hands? 2. 1 more in this batch? Nope. We'll do 1 and 2 then. Go ahead, please. Too big tech? Uh-huh. Right? Yeah. Right. How do we put checks and balances on the mega companies, sort of? So I don't know if you could hear all that, but it's basically the big tech companies act almost like they're their own government. Lots of the rest of us don't have somebody the size of Microsoft on our side. And so there was a law professor who wrote a good article called Facebookistan, which is like Facebook's a country like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and all that. And the point was Facebook's now a bigger, more important player than many sovereign nations. 200 sovereign nations in the UN. Facebook's bigger financially and in other measures than they are. And so now do we have to start talking about Facebook's foreign policy? Okay, see, because that's what the question is, roughly speaking, I think. One thing to note is if these companies break the law and their people are walking around inside the United States, they can get arrested and put in jail. So governments still have the definitions that usually is the monopoly on lawful use of force. Governments are allowed to arrest people. And companies that just simply ignore the law have that at their peril. So in Europe, Google had one of their people arrested for violating privacy laws in Italy back a while ago. And that got attention of Google people. You know, I said that Europe treats those companies as sort of foreign invaders and has a lot of skepticism. And their ability to lobby in Europe is sort of middle of the road. They've undoubtedly been super persuasive in Washington over a lot of the last 20 years. And undoubtedly, both on the left and the right, there's less trust in the big companies now than there were. So 10 or 20 years ago, everybody wanted to be on the side of technology, innovation, growth. Everybody in Washington wanted that. And now, in the State of the Union and in Congress, you'll see all these criticisms of the sort of unchecked power on big technology. So I think the US is going through a shift, and it's going to be a lot more contested. There's issues about antitrust, like what's a monopoly or not. There's issues around privacy, data security, huge issues about the future of AI and ChatGPT and stuff like that. And so I think that if you were in those, I work with those companies too as well. If you were in those companies now, you'd feel like you're under siege. You'd feel like every day you wake up and there's another criticism and my God, what are we going to say about that? So that was not the case 10 years ago, and it is the case for them today. So they're in a new period, and how that will play out for 3 or 5 or 10 years from now, I don't know. But they feel not like they're living free and easy and can do what they want. They feel like folks are coming at them a lot of different ways, day and night. It's a different change. Yes, sir. Sure. I asked for 3 questions, and I only got 2 hands, so you get the follow-up question, then we'll go to you. Go ahead. Sure. Cambridge Analytica, which was a big privacy mess for Facebook, happened at the time California was considering its privacy legislation, and it went from wasn't going to pass to suddenly it passed. Cambridge Analytica directly led to the California privacy law passing. Look, we're not going to stop privacy problems because we live in a data society, and we're going to have contested views about what we should do with data. So people here will have different ideas of like, so for instance, let's say you're starting a student club on campus. You'd like to get an email list of all the other students on campus so you could have them come to your meeting. Well, that's participation, student goodness, wonderfulness, it goes on your CV. It's also maybe a privacy invasion if the other students didn't sign up for that. So you're doing what you think is a good deed. You're starting a good student agency, student activity, and other people can say that's bad the way you're getting the mailing list. We're going to have endless debates about that. But if the US does pass a law like this, there'll be a legal structure within which to have those debates. And right now, there's not even that legal structure most of the time, and so it's harder for privacy to have a chance a lot of the time. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Current trends in Supreme Court decisions do they threaten this?
Current trends in US Supreme Court decisions, do they threaten it? I'm writing an article about current trends in US Supreme Court and as it affects the European stuff. Here's one way it threatens it. When do you get to go into federal court and say that your rights were violated? So there's a law called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It's the law that makes sure you can see your credit report and you can correct mistakes in your credit report. Somebody brought a lawsuit, and it turned out TransUnion, one of the credit reporting companies, had mistakenly put a few thousand people in the wrong list. They put regular people on the terrorist watch list. And people sued about that. You can see that would be disruptive maybe to see your credit history, a few other things. Okay. And it made it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the following: you can only sue in federal court if you have injury in fact, if you've actually been hurt. And the law as written made it look like everybody with the wrong data had been hurt. The Supreme Court said that's not good enough, the law. If the data got sent from TransUnion to someone else, then there was an injury. But if you were just sitting in the TransUnion database on the wrong list, terrorist watch list, you weren't injured. It was just sitting there and never had been touched. And so they found the part of Congress's law that would have protected those people. Oh my God, I'm on the terrorist watch list, and they never told me. And said, you do not have the ability to get into federal court as a matter of constitutional law. Federal judges cannot be given the power to help you there. So that's taking an idea of who gets injured by privacy. I mean, I don't know. I'll ask for a show of hands. I'm going to ask first whether you think that you have been injured if you're on the terrorist watch list in TransUnion, or if you haven't. So who thinks you've been injured if you're on the terrorist watch list? And who thinks you haven't been injured if you're on the terrorist watch list? Okay, the Supreme Court majority says that clear view of everyone in the room who raised their hand is wrong as a matter of constitutional law. I think that's lousy constitutional law. I don't think that's what should happen. And so there's a risk that the Supreme Court will look at this new privacy law and it will decide, oh, you don't have the right injury, you can't sue. Or it'll decide the company has free speech rights in order to sell its list of customers. And the First Amendment smacks down the privacy law. So we might see challenges like that. And I hope those challenges don't win. But this court has been pretty narrow in what it lets people do to vindicate their rights in this kind of place. So we'll see. How are we? We have time for one more question. Anybody have one thing, question or comment? Oh my gosh. What do you want to get? Professor Truex.
Opt out of targeted advertising?
Yeah.
Are we looking at having to pay for all of our social, like, do they mean targeted advertising as a receipt targeted advertising, or the data collection point?
It's hard to tell. Okay, so one of the worries is if targeted advertising doesn't work anymore, well, you have to pay for subscriptions to all the services because they won't have free way to make advertising. Answer is maybe yes, or maybe some other time. Stuff isn't free. Right now, the business model for most of the apps on your phone is to advertise to you better. If a bunch of that gets closed down, maybe you'll have fewer apps. And you'll have better privacy protection, and you won't have as much creepy stuff following you. We have to decide as a society how we want to live with that. And you all, for the rest of your careers, are going to get to help make those decisions because you're going to live in a society where these things are going to be battled out. So with that, I think it's a good time to stop and thank you for your attention.